Hello, today I'll be recapping the 2019 horror fantasy movie called Mermaid Down. Warning, this is a very strange movie and spoilers ahead. The film opens and two fishermen talk about ancient fantasy creatures. One of them is a bit crazy and convinced he could capture a mermaid and sell it for $1 million. He says there have been rumors and sightings around this area. Later, the two sit aboard a boat and toss nuts and bolts into the water. Nearby, a man named Dr. Bayer cruises on a ship and enjoys the day. He hears screaming and looks over at the fishing boat. In the water, a mermaid is trapped in a large net and squeals. The fishermen pull her up and she struggles to break free. Dr. Bayer watches from a distance and is shocked at what he sees. The men, who we learn are named Stanley and Duncan, drop her to the ground, then run away as the mermaid crawls out. She makes it to the edge of the boat, but the men come back with a shotgun and axe. They strike her in the face, then stand on her hand. She makes a dolphin-sounding noise and fights back, but Stanley manages to restrain her with a rope. Despite this, she dives overboard and pulls him down with her. Stanley is dragged around, but Duncan fires his shotgun into the water and hits the mermaid. He pulls them up and screams at her in the net. Meanwhile, Dr. Bayer jumps off his boat and swims towards them. Now injured, the mermaid is tied up and she hangs by her tail. Dr. Bayer sneaks onto the ship and watches from behind a wall. Duncan then approaches the mermaid and holds his axe. He pauses for a second, then swings it aggressively at her tail. She makes another high-pitched sound, then Duncan hears something. He walks inside and Dr. Bayer hides and notices the axe dripping with blood. Duncan then goes back outside and he continues chopping at the tail until it's removed. He then throws her into the chum bucket with other fish and closes the lid. After, he discovers Dr. Bayer, who reveals he is a psychiatrist. To save the mermaid, he offers to buy her for $1 million. As they talk, they hear a splash and see the tail has fallen into the water. As Duncan stares at it, the doctor hits him over the head, then picks up the axe. For some reason, he kills the dude and has a very evil look on his face. He opens the hatch and dumps some water on the mermaid, then closes it. Are you confused yet? Because I definitely am. Later, we see Bayer's mental home for women where a bunch of patients watch a film. One of them has an imaginary friend who appears as a ghost. It rushes into the room and says she thinks there is something in the bathroom. The women rush over, but one worker explains it's just the new patient. After 3 months, the mermaid grows legs and only eats fish. She cannot properly walk yet though, so she uses a wheelchair. Later, Dr. Bayer receives a call from the safety inspector, but he doesn't answer. They also want him to close off the entrance to the basement, which used to be an insane asylum. He rejects this though because he states he works down there. One of the workers tries to talk with the mermaid, but she just stares back strangely. She gives her a toy to play with, and it happens to be a mermaid. The actual mermaid breaks the toy to pieces and it falls to the ground. She then points at herself, then to the toy, to try and imply that was her. However, the worker thinks she is trying to use sign language. Soon after, the ghost brings her a wheelchair and discovers the mermaid can see her. The next day, another man named Dr. Miller arrives at the home. They watch the mermaid sit in the shower and see relief when water falls on her. That night, all the mental patients sit together and eat dinner. Somehow, the mermaid really does know sign language and she signs to Dr. Miller. He states she said she doesn't belong here and belongs in the ocean. Dr. Miller questions how she learned to sign and she replies saying pirates. The workers then realize she thinks she is a mermaid. She states when she is on land, mermaids blend into full humans. Finally, she tells the doctor she is dying because not all of them can survive on land. Before they all go to bed, a patient named Raina spits on the mermaid and swears at her. In the middle of the night, things get even more confusing and Dr. Bayer takes the mermaid into the basement asylum. The other workers don't join him because they are too scared. The other patients wonder where they took her and one named Linda goes to explore. In the basement, Dr. Bayer locks the mermaid in isolation as a punishment for giving away her secret. Linda sneaks through the rooms but is spotted by the doctor. She goes to explain herself, but he tells her go ahead and gives her a flashlight. He then shuts the door behind her and smiles to himself. Linda looks around and the ghost calls for her, but there's no point. She then falls into a chamber and a dog kills her, which really matches the randomness of the film. The next day, the mermaid is freed from isolation. Dr. Miller and the others examine her and she begins to walk. Later, she punches out a window and climbs outside. Dr. Bayer is distracted and he doesn't notice all the other patients escaping too. They all sprint through the woods and come across a nearby river. They sit around and the mermaid mermaid wades in the dirty water. Eventually, they all get too cold and they head back, but Reyna, the ghost, and the mermaid stay the night. In the morning, the ghost discovers the mermaid now has a tail from staying in the river, but it dried up overnight. The ghost tells her she will go and get her wheelchair and push her to the ocean. Later, Dr. Byer and the worker leave the mental home and drive on the road. They come across the mermaid pushing herself across the street. The doctor instantly recognizes her, but the worker doesn't notice, so he says nothing. He then looks at her and speeds up and hits her with the car. He gets out and he carries her inside with the help of a security guard. The lady worker just stands in shock and stares at the creature. They lock the other patients in a room and restrain the mermaid to a bed. They then wheel her outside as the others watch through a window. They load the mermaid into a car, then suddenly Dr. Byer attacks the security guard with a hammer. He turns and stares back, and the lady worker tells the others to be quiet. She then says he's not going to let any of them walk out alive, or else he wouldn't be able to keep the mermaid for himself. Dr. Byer enters the home and slams onto the door but can't force it open. Other workers hide in the bathroom, and this seems like it might become a full-on slasher film. One of them leaves the bathroom but is killed by a shotgun blast. The other patients jump out of the window and leave, and Dr. Byers enters the bathroom with a Tommy gun. He starts firing on some patients, and the others scream when they hear the shots. They escape, then Dr. Byer enters the car and begins to drive off. The mermaid sits up in the back seat, then sprays some black fluid out of her mouth. What? The doctor stops and he questionably tastes it, and he realizes it's ink. He cleans his window, then continues driving, unfazed. He makes it to a nearby bay and boards his boat with the mermaid. He then locks her up in an isolated room. He says he plans to experiment on her as a case study. Meanwhile, the lady worker arrives in a taxi and sneaks onto the boat. However, she cannot find them, and she thinks she went to the wrong boat. But she then hears a high-pitched squealing sound coming from behind a wall. She starts to push on it and discovers a secret handle. It opens and she sees the mermaid, but not Dr. Byer. He then appears behind her and she aims the gun at him. A shot goes off and the doctor is hit in the hand. The mermaid takes the opportunity to grab him and choke him until he passes out. She is then freed from her restraints and makes it back to the water to swim away. The other patients get trapped in the room and it begins to fill with water from a leak. Dr. Byer then regains consciousness and starts drowning the worker. The mermaid then returns and the two fight until she kills him for good using her tail. The ship then begins to sink, but the mermaid breaks the roof and they make it back to shore. The patients spend the night in a cave, then the mermaid returns and thanks them. She says goodbye to the ghost, then disappears into the ocean. That's the end of the movie. Hopefully you found it interesting, and at the very least I saved you from ever making the awful mistake of watching the entire thing.